Major funding for these broadcasts is made possible by grants from Capital One Bank and Chase Commercial Term Lending, the Witkoff Group, New York Community Bank, M&T Bank, Greenberg Traurig, Perfect Building Maintenance, Genova Burns. Additional funding is provided by grants from AKA Hotels, Corman Communities, Aerial Property Advisors, AVR Realty Company, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Bank Leumi USA, Briarwood Organization, CBRE, Citizens Bank, Colliers International NYC, CPEX Real Estate Services, Cushman & Wakefield, Customers Bank, DDG, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Fisher Brothers, First Nationwide Title Agency, Flushing Bank, Foley & Lardner, Friedman, Handler Real Estate Organization, HAP Investment Developers, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Chairman USRealty.com, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, Madison Realty Capital, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Matone Group, Mercantile Commerce Bank, N.A., Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Grubb Knight Frank, Newbanks, MHP Real Estate Services, Optimum Window Manufacturing Corp., People's United Bank, Rosewood Realty Group, SJP Properties, Sterling National Bank, Sterling Risk, Stonehenge Partners, TD Bank, Terra CRG, the Continuum Company, the CUNY TV Foundation, the Moynihan Group, and these friends.
Russia, Vienna, the city of New York, Connecticut, scrap metal, Connecticut, again, 375 West End Avenue, Rabbinical School, Yale, Rabbi, Broadway producer, TV network for Russians and Jews? Rabbi, I have the famous Rabbi Mark Golub here today. Thank you for being here.
Michael, it is a joy sitting with you. I'm not a famous rabbi. Everything else you said was almost right.
It was Newsweek who said you were in the top 50 most prestigious rabbis. And then I read also that you were once considered one of the handsomest rabbis.
Not handsomest.
Okay, but
sexiest.
Sexiest rabbis, but that's what Ruth says about you also. Okay. So tell me about your great-grandparents.
I was very lucky. And, you get no credit. There's no zechut from having wonderful and interesting grandparents, but I had them. On my mother's side, my grandparents came from Russia, and my grandfather, Ben Newman, whom everybody called Pop, Ben Newman got smicha, rabbinic ordination, from the famed Slobodka Yeshiva in Lithuania, and he came over to America to be a rabbi in the beginning of the 20th century, and they brought him to Norwalk, Connecticut, and the story goes that the president of the congregation spent an afternoon with my grandfather walking around and explaining to my grandfather everything he would do as rabbi in Norwalk, Connecticut. When the walk was over, my grandfather said to me, "You don't know how to talk to a rabbi. I will kosher, he was a shochet as well, I will kosher a week's worth of chickens for you, and I'm out of here." And so he never served as a rabbi one day, and he went into New York City and painted apartments with his brother and didn't like that very much, and went out to be with other family members in the Midwest and many of his generation Jews who came over.
So he settles in the Midwest in Ohio, and how does the rabbi, become involved with the scrap metal and the peddling business?
Yes, by the way, he had to make a living, and the only thing he could do was come to somebody's home, and he did not know English, and when it said beware of dog, he had no idea what that meant. So he was chased by many dogs, and he ended up looking for junk. He was a junk dealer. And then one day, Michael, he found a metal. And he found out that people paid a lot of money for that piece of metal. And he began only looking for scraps of metal. And he would ask people if he could rummage around their barns. It wasn't really real garages, but barns. And he would find scrap metal. And he would ultimately sell the scrap metal to a metal company. And he began to make a very good living. And he ultimately went into the steel business. And he was part of a company that built the bodies for trucks and school buses in Union City, Ohio.
Let's go to the other side of the family.
So my other grandparents, my grandfather on my father's side, Jacob Golub, came over from Minsk and ultimately was a very devoted student and had a PhD and went into Jewish education in the early part of the 20th century and was one of the pioneers of Jewish education in the Reform movement and became a distinguished member of the Board of Education in Chicago. And he lived in the Midwest, Chicago and in Cincinnati. He was married to my grandmother on my father's side, Rose Golub, who ultimately also very educated, went to Chicago University and then got her master's in art at Columbia at an advanced age. But her family was from Vienna. And they came and settled in Texas. She was the oldest of 9. They were very, very poor. And she met my grandfather who courted her, won her.
Wait. She's in Texas. So how did they meet in Texas?
They met at University of Chicago.
They met in University of Chicago. Okay, so now, as I was saying before, Pop wanted to find your mother.
Correct.
Okay, a Jewish person.
Correct.
Okay, so he liked coming back to New York City,
Correct.
where he worked as a painter at one time.
Yes, a
long time ago. So the steel magnate came back and had an apartment at 375 West.
Ultimately, they settled at 375, which is on 78th and West End Avenue. Actually, I was born on Central Park West, but when my brother was born, we all moved into my grandfather's.
Okay, we got to go back.
Right.
And now let's talk about the family, your mother.
So you're absolutely correct that my grandfather decided that as his 2 daughters, his oldest was my mother, Rebecca, named Betty, and the second was a gorgeous aunt, Kitty. Her name was Sarah. He was very worried, especially about Kitty, that they should come back to New York. And in Union City, Ohio, they were the only Jewish family in Union City, Ohio. So he brought the family back to New York so that they would be able to find Jewish spouses. And in those days, Jewish families took marrying Jews very seriously. My mother once said to me, "You are able to fall in love with anybody. A lovely person is a lovely person. The only way a Jew will not marry somebody who's not Jewish is if you don't date them." And so my mother had a hard and fast rule. She would never date a non-Jew. She came back. She ultimately went to Columbia Law School.
No, but before she went to Columbia Law School, she went to Michigan.
She was at the University of Michigan, Phi Beta Kappa, did extraordinarily well, and then was one of the first women who was studying at Columbia Law. And the story is that she's told Columbia Law she would come, but she had to be exempt from all classes that were held on Shabbat, Saturday. And she never went to a Shabbat class. Anyway, she did meet my father, who was graduating.
But we got to talk about how Dad came to New York.
Okay. So my father is with his parents in Cincinnati, Midwest. And my grandfather, his father, Jacob Golub, comes down with Parkinson's. And he was a very dynamic, expansive person, and this really handicapped him severely. And they moved to New York City and lived on 112th Street, right off Riverside Drive, in large measure so he could have medical care and have an easier life, and he maintained.
Now, what did he do?
He, again, was in Jewish education, a pioneer in Jewish education. One of the things that I reflected upon, Michael, later and didn't even realize, so much of my work, and we'll get to it on Jewish television, really is an imitation of what my grandfather did in the early years of the 20th century.
Right, and he was very involved with the Reconstructionist movement.
Correct. He was a colleague of Mordechai Kaplan, was an original founder of the Reconstructionist movement, of the SAJ, the flagship synagogue here in New York for the SAJ, was one of the first contributing editors to the Reconstructionist magazine. So you had in two grandfathers an Orthodox rabbi with smicha from one of the great yeshivot of Eastern Europe, and you have an intellectual grandfather from Chicago, University of Chicago and Columbia, was where he got his master's, who is with Mordechai Kaplan.
Oh.
Two very, very different views of Jewish life.
And who was the grandmother who wrote the book?
His wife, Rose Golub, was one of the early writers of children's books in the Reform movement. And again, we take this all for granted now. There were no textbooks for children written in English for kids who weren't going to yeshiva. So my grandmother's book was Down Holiday Lane. She had a degree in early childhood education and wrote the classic kids' holiday book, Down Holiday Lane, about two kids, Leo and Huldah, which were the names of her two children, Leo being my father. And the book was dedicated to her first grandson, Mark.
Oh.
Yes.
Well, you understand why Pop came here. Mom went to Michigan, went to Columbia. How does she meet Leo? Leo, who became a dentist.
That is correct. Leo's at Columbia, studying at Columbia, when my mother's at Columbia Law School. And they met through the Jewish organization at Columbia. And my father was in a managerial position of some kind, and they were at an evening event, and my father came up to my mother and said, "I'm sorry, you have to come with me. We have a meeting downstairs." And so my mother, who was part of this Jewish organization, got up and went downstairs, and there was a dance that was for an intimate group of people, and my father and mother danced the whole night, and that was that. They were then married as he graduated Columbia and began his dental school career, and they went into the Navy, and my mother finished law school, never really practiced law, and went to work at the SAJ, the Reconstructionist Synagogue, where Mordechai Kaplan was, and she was the assistant to Ira Eisenstein, who was the rabbi there and the son-in-law of Mordechai Kaplan.
Okay.
So I grew up playing in Ira's office under my mother's desk.
You were a West Side kid.
I was
exactly
right.
You were a true West Side kid.
I am.
Under the influence of the West Side community.
That is correct.
Okay, which is a diverse community, especially with SAJ.
Oh, that is so
BJ,
perceptive of you.
And everything.
Absolutely.
With all different type of denominations of different sects of Judaism.
Yes.
Over there. Dad goes into the Navy, the Merchant Marine.
Actually, he's in the Navy when he's in law school, when he's in dental school. And after he has his law, I can keep saying law, his dental degree, he opens up a practice in New York. The Korean War comes, and he decides, rather than be drafted, he will join the public health service.
Right. So,
and that's when we leave New York.
And he ends up in Connecticut.
At the Groton subbase.
At the Groton subbase over there. And then he's involved with the Danbury prison.
Excellent. He is transferred from the subbase to the Danbury Correctional Institute in Danbury, Connecticut. And that's where I begin to be a person. I'm in third grade. I'm in second grade in Niantic, Connecticut. Third grade through seventh grade in Danbury. And after my father completes his service, he opens up his first dental practice in Trumbull, Connecticut, a real hick town at the time. And we moved from Danbury to Trumbull, and I go to high school in Trumbull, Connecticut. And so if somebody says, "Where did you grow up?" I feel that where a person goes to high school is the formative years of his life. So I went to junior high and high school in Trumbull, Connecticut, and I studied at the Conservative Movement Synagogue Rodef Sholem in Bridgeport, Connecticut, while my father created the first conservative synagogue in Trumbull, and we broke ground, and my father was the lay rabbi when the JTS guy couldn't get up to the synagogue, and the student rabbi from JTS would stay in our house. And when my father led services on the alternating Fridays, I was the chazan and taught in the religious school there, and fell in love with the whole
during
thing.
this time, you also traveled back to 375 West End Avenue.
All the time.
And you used to go with your grandfather, I believe, to the Karambach Synagogue.
Karabach Synagogue. If anybody knows the West Side, we were on 78th and West End, and around the corner on 79th is the Karabach Synagogue. Most people associate it with Shlomo Karabach, but it's really Karabach's father. Shlomo Karabach's father was a revered and renowned rabbi from Eastern Europe.
Now, you said your grandfather used to sit at on the end of the row?
Yes. It was an interesting model I learned about what Orthodox Judaism could be. It was an open, loving orthodoxy. And for people who know, in an Orthodox synagogue, men and women sit separately, and there is a dividing wall of some kind. Sometimes the women were upstairs. In the Karabach synagogue, the women sat on the right side of the wall, and the men sat on the left side of the wall. And my grandfather worked it out that his seat was on the aisle. The aisle was to his right. The dividing wall was to the right of the aisle, and the dividing wall was shoulder height, and above the shoulder was a white curtain. And my grandfather worked it out that his wife, my grandmother, Mom, Frida, would have the inside seat in the same aisle. So that any time my grandfather wanted to talk to my grandmother, he would lift the curtain and talk to Frida through the mechitza. That was a very interesting model for me. And many things happened that were formative in my understanding of what Judaism was at that Karabach synagogue. But one of the things that I saw was it wasn't about a hard and fast rule. It was about people. And the Jewish tradition and Judaism is all about people. Sometimes there are Jews who mistake and think it's all about God. The Jewish tradition is all about people. And the way my grandfather set it up, his relationship to his wife, in some way was always present, even through the mechitza. And that became symbolic for me of how Judaism in general and people in general and how rabbis who are teaching Judaism should communicate.
Your father established the conservative synagogue, said in Trumbull.
Correct. He was a lay leader. You're absolutely
lay leader
right.
at the synagogue. How did you decide when you were young that you were going to become a rabbi?
I remember vividly making that decision. It was as I was completing high school. I'd been very, very involved in Jewish life, synagogue life. Everywhere I looked in my family, people were involved in Judaism. Again, my father is a lay leader in Trumbull, Connecticut. My paternal grandfather is at the SAJ. My maternal grandfather is an Orthodox rabbi who has a profound love of the Jewish tradition and was very learned. My grandmother is writing books for the Reform movement when nobody was doing it. So, and I loved everything about the synagogue. So I said to myself, what do you want to do as a career that you'll enjoy? And I thought to myself, I'll become a rabbi. Now you understand, Michael, I have no idea how true this is for you in your profession, and you're in real estate. You've done many interesting things throughout your whole life. But nobody who is going into the rabbinate has a clue what being a rabbi means. You have no idea of what it meant. And so all the reasons I went into the rabbinate, all of them were legitimate. But I had no idea the problems that plague an American rabbi, and which were probably the reason my grandfather, after one conversation with the president in Norwalk, Connecticut, said to him, "You don't understand how you talk to a rabbi. I'm out of here." And I've had a very, very lucky rabbinic career. I have a very, with a small o, unorthodox career.
Okay, but you have a unique rabbinical career because besides a rabbi, you've enhanced your career to other sides.
Correct.
As opposed to just being a pulpit rabbi.
You are correct.
Your mother went to Michigan. Your father went to Columbia. How do you decide? You wanted to go to Yale, you told me. What happened?
I want to go to I made the waiting list. And in those days, if you made the waiting list but you weren't accepted, you didn't have parents who said, well, let's wait or let's see or go up and talk to them. I made the waiting list at Yale. I was in at Columbia. My father had gone to Columbia. My grandfather had gone to Columbia. They said, go to Columbia. So I went to Columbia.
At this time, your dad, he made the decision to get involved with the hotel business, the Holiday Inns?
In his 40s, my father never loved being a dentist. And he was only so successful at it. And then he had the opportunity to be part of the building and owning of a Holiday Inn in Groton, Connecticut. And
right.
My mother found the location. His opportunity was simply to find a location, and my mother found Groton, Connecticut. And with a cousin of his who owned a Holiday Inn in Danville, Virginia, they built the Holiday Inn in Groton. His cousin left, and my father bought him out, and ultimately my father ran that Holiday Inn in
And he
Groton.
opened up in Bridgeport?
Then he opened one in New London, Connecticut, Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he had another inn in Sarasota, Florida.
But now, you went to work. You were in the restaurant.
It is
the
true.
room check.
Yes. I ran the front desk with my brother, and I ran the coffee shop every morning, and I learned an enormous. I had been a soda jerk at Howard Johnson as my father was building the Holiday Inn.
That was your apprenticeship.
I had no idea how important being a soda jerk at Howard Johnson as a summer job would be for me when I ultimately became the manager of the coffee shop at the Holiday Inn of Groton. And I spent many, many, many hours there over summers, obviously during the year I was in college.
So you come to Columbia for your undergraduate. Where are you living? Are you living at 375 or are you living off campus?
No, I'm on campus.
You're on campus. So talk to me about those years when you were at Columbia.
I will give you a thumbnail as the following. I did very, very well at Trumbull High School. So you come from Trumbull High School and you're a star. You think you're a star. You come to Columbia and you find out what it is to be a star. I'm with Bronx, Stuyvesant and Bronx Science and Horace Mann and Fieldston. These kids are leagues ahead of me in thinking, in writing, in the books that they've read. And it takes me 2 years to catch up. 2 years. After 2 years, I could run at that speed. When I got there, I was way out of my depth.
Now, when you were over there at Columbia, what did you do during the summers? The hotels?
Yes, exactly right. And at Columbia, in addition to studies, and I became a religion major because I knew I was going to be a rabbi.
Right, but at Columbia, you got the bug of radio.
That is correct. I loved radio, always had. And so I worked with WKCR. And KCR was an public FM station broadcasting throughout the tri-state area. Most college stations are campus-oriented. This was not a campus station. This was a New York City station, and I ultimately became the general manager of WKCR, AM and FM.
Did you have your show at that time?
I had interview show that ultimately became the longest-running interview show in the history of the station to this day. And we created a series in my senior year called The Biology of Love, which we did in cooperation with Planned Parenthood. It was the first sex education series on New York radio, and after it was completed, it was used by the New York City Board of Education. That is a minor little factoid of my life, which most people do not know.
But I did my research.
You do. You know everything, Michael.
So now you're at Columbia. It's time to say, hey, I want to be a rabbi. Now, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist. How do you decide?
That's very good.
To become.
And by the way, up so far in my life, I have an Orthodox rabbi, a Reconstructionist rabbi, Jewish leader. I grew up in a mainstream conservative household. That was the compromise my mother and father made. They were mainstream conservative. And now I have to really decide, am I going to JTS, a great institution aligned with the conservative movement?
And not far from Columbia.
A stone's throw. Or do I go to HUC, JAR, in New York, which was one of the three branches of the Reform movement?
How come you didn't think of HUC in Cincinnati?
HUC in Cincinnati was classical Reform. And what I had to find was a branch of Reform Judaism more open to the Jewish perspective of being more traditional. And New York had a reputation of being on the more traditional end of the Reform movement. So it never occurred to me to go to Cincinnati.
That was HUC at that time in Lower Manhattan, near NYU?
No, it was it was then on 60, I want to get it right. It was on, I think it was on 66th Street between Columbus and Central Park West. It was next to the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. And that's where I went for my entire 5 years, actually 6 years. I stayed for one doctoral year. So for 6 years, I was at HUC-JR in New York City. And I was, again, this is by accident. The group that came in with me was the first group that was really traditionally oriented. So that when you're a freshman, a first-year student, you had to lead services for a week. When it was my turn to lead services, I said I was going to lead services wearing a talit. At the time, the Reform movement almost eschewed the talis. So it was a big deal that I was going to wear a talis.
Now, was this when you were playing basketball with the guys? No.
Yes.
I mean, the team picture over there with the basketball player.
The picture you see here is right after I'm ordained. I'm with WMCA by that time.
Right, and you had the full beard at that time.
I did.
And so you're ordained, and we have that nice picture of you being ordained, with that full beard, the dark black beard.
You know when I grew the beard? I grew the beard at a specific moment in time. I'm going to give you the month and year. You may not get it, and I'll then tell you. And I'll be interested to see if any of our viewers know. May of 1970. An event occurred in May. I think it was May 5th, but I'm not positive. May 5th, 1970, that had a profound impact on me, and I grew a beard.
What was it, since I'm not good?
Kent State. When Kent State happened, I was so shocked that American National Guardsmen would actually fire at a group of protesting college students, that it changed my vision of what activism meant. And I remember growing a beard, and I had a beard, as you showed in the picture when I was ordained, I had a long beard. And at one point it got even longer. So, over time, the beard has been cut back.
So what we're going to do is next week's installment, which is perfectly timed. Now that you're ordained rabbi, we have to find out what happens over the next 45 years of your life.
I will enjoy that very much.
And we'll talk, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Michael.